I'll never forget the moment he stepped into my first-class row. I had just settled into my seat, earbuds in, the hum of the Atlanta runway fading beneath us, thinking this flight would be normal, just a few hours of work and quiet. Then he appeared, a man in a crisp suit, polished, confident, and suddenly, my world felt smaller. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth, polite, yet carrying an invisible weight. "Would you mind switching seats?" This passenger booked first class. My stomach dropped. Every instinct screamed, "Just move, it's easier, stay invisible." But I didn't. I looked at him, at my ticket, at the subtle tension in the crew's posture, and I felt it, the quiet assumption that I didn't belong here. The pity in some of their eyes made my chest ache. This wasn't just about a seat, it was about being erased, dismissed, treated like I wasn't worthy of the space I had earned. Before I could even catch my breath, a subtle tremor in the cabin caught my attention. The flight attendant hovering nervously, the whispered glances between crew members, the soft shuffle of a nearby passenger's feet. All of it screamed that something bigger was at play, and yet here I was, expected to fold under a request that stung with injustice. I clenched my fists, heart pounding, but my mind sharpened. And in that split second, I knew I had a choice: give in and vanish, or stay visible, no matter the cost. If you've ever been judged, dismissed, or treated like you don't belong, you have to hear what happens next. Subscribe now. This story isn't just entertainment, it's proof of what refusing invisibility can do. You can't afford to miss it. I didn't move. I reached for my phone, feeling the heat of every gaze, the quiet tension of every hesitant step behind me. The man's confident smile faltered. The crew shifted, their whispers brushing the edges of my awareness. I realized, with a sudden jolt, that this was no ordinary flight, no ordinary passenger, no ordinary request. The air between us thickened, charged with an invisible current of power, fear, and expectation. And then a faint click from the galley caught my attention, almost too soft to notice. Something was about to happen, something no one on this plane could predict. I could feel it in my bones. Would standing my ground protect me, or would it drag me into a storm I hadn't prepared for? The hum of the plane beneath me was steady, almost soothing, but my mind refused to settle. I glanced around the first-class cabin again, letting my eyes linger on polished seats, the shimmer of overhead compartments, the subtle nods of crew members as they passed. I knew these spaces. I had grown up watching my mom navigate them, seeing her hold conversations where every word, every glance, every pause mattered. But knowing how it worked and being accepted into it were two entirely different things. I was young, yes, but I had experience. I'd earned my place here in ways most passengers would never notice. Perfect manners, careful observation, a constant sense of awareness that the room was judging me even before I spoke. Still, despite all that preparation, moments like this reminded me how fragile visibility could be. A polite request, a smile, and suddenly the invisible line between belonging and being sidelined was drawn in the air around me. The crew hovered near the galley, their movements almost mechanical, but I caught the little tells, the slight hesitation when their eyes met mine, the subtle avoidance of direct contact. One attendant, a younger woman, adjusted her uniform 3 times in quick succession as if preparing herself for something she couldn't name. It was the smallest of microaggressions, almost invisible, but I saw it. I felt it. Every slight nod, every careful step was a message, and the message was clear. You are here, but not really. I closed my eyes for a moment and imagined all the first-class passengers who had sat here before me, most unaware of the scrutiny behind every polished smile, every professional gesture. I had seen it countless times. Passengers assuming entitlement, crews silently enforcing expectations, moments of quiet judgment that cut deeper than any overt insult. And yet, I had learned to move with discretion, to respond with subtlety, to navigate this invisible battlefield without ever letting anyone see my fear. A faint vibration on my phone reminded me that the world beyond this cabin still existed. But right now, the stakes felt heavier, more intimate. Every whispered glance, every hesitant gesture, carried weight. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would test everything I thought I knew about belonging. And then, as I opened my eyes, I realized the tension in the cabin had shifted again, almost imperceptibly, but I knew instinctively that whatever was about to happen next would force a decision I wasn't prepared for. The moment stretched, the cabin air thick with unspoken rules and expectations. I watched the crew more closely now, noting how their movements faltered the second the businessman lingered nearby. A subtle glance here, a nervous shuffle there. They weren't just being polite. They were calculating, gauging how far they could push me without triggering an incident. But I had been watching these micropatterns for years, learning how to navigate elite spaces without losing myself. Every twitch of a hand, every fleeting eye contact was a code I could read, and right now, the code said caution. The hum of the engines beneath me seemed louder, almost echoing the tension. It was rhythmic, persistent, like the heartbeat of this floating microcosm of power, money, and prejudice. Conversations murmured in hushed tones. No one dared to speak directly about the elephant in the cabin, but I could hear it anyway. A faint chuckle from 2 rows ahead, a sharp intake of breath as the businessman cleared his throat. Every sound was loaded, weighted, telling a story I didn't need words to understand. I shifted slightly in my seat, noticing the subtle hierarchy unfolding. The attendants deferred to each other, their glances suggesting something unsaid, a chain of command that wasn't written in any training manual. Something about this interaction felt deliberate, almost rehearsed. I realized, with a mix of caution and disbelief, that this wasn't just about a seat. It was about testing boundaries, about seeing how far they could bend me without breaking the rules. And maybe, just maybe, I was meant to be the one who didn't bend. From the corner of my eye, I caught the businessman's hand gesture, a slight flick of the wrist that didn't belong to a polite request. There was intention there, subtle but precise, like a chess player moving pieces no one else could see. And I understood, in that sharp, silent way only some of us can, that his presence wasn't random. There was an agenda hidden beneath the calm exterior, and I was at the center of it, whether I realized it or not. A bead of sweat formed at my temple, not from fear but from recognition. This was more than discomfort, it was strategy, testing, manipulation. And just as I began to calculate my next move, the cabin shifted again, almost imperceptibly, but I sensed it immediately. Something had changed, and I knew without question. The next moment would force me to act, to reveal strength I hadn't yet needed to display. And then I noticed a flicker in the flight attendant's eyes, a hesitation so slight it could have been imagined, but I knew it wasn't. The question hung there, heavy. Would they obey the unspoken rules, or would someone finally break the pattern? His voice carried the kind of calm authority that demanded attention, the smile polite but edged with expectation. "I really need you to switch seats," he said again, just slightly firmer this time. Each word landed in the cabin like a subtle weight, echoing off the muted walls and the soft hum of the engines beneath us. I could feel the temperature shift around me, though nothing on the thermostat had changed, an invisible current of judgment and entitlement flowing through first class. I sat back, holding my ticket in my hand, my mind running in loops. Move, and I become invisible. Resist, and I risk confrontation. The moral tightrope felt impossibly thin. My stomach twisted as I sensed the eyes of other passengers flicking toward me, curiosity mixed with unspoken assumptions. Some were polite observers, some were quietly waiting to see what would happen, and a few carried that look of subtle disdain, an invisible tally of who they believed belonged here and who didn't. Anger flared first, hot and sharp. How dare he assume I would step aside just because of his suit, his confidence, his assumed superiority? I could feel the resentment coiling in my chest, and yet fear threaded through it, a reminder that this wasn't just about me. It was about the social rules of an elite space that operated on discretion, appearances, and quiet compliance. I glanced at the crew, hoping for a sign of support or hesitation that could tip the balance. Their movements were careful, their expressions controlled, but in that carefulness, I could read their doubt. Something had shifted when he spoke the second time. Even they sensed there was more at play than a simple seat dispute. The subtle choreography of first-class authority was being tested, and I was unwillingly cast as the lead performer. The businessman leaned slightly closer, offering another polite, patient smile that did nothing to soften the edge in his eyes. My fingers tightened around my phone in my bag. Every instinct told me to act, but my mind raced through scenarios, weighing dignity against practicality, pride against risk. A moment stretched too long. And then, just as I opened my mouth to respond, a sudden realization hit me. This wasn't just a man asking for a seat. Something else was happening here, something deliberate, and the next move I made could change everything. My hand hovered over my bag, and then I did it. I pulled out my phone, the familiar weight suddenly feeling like a lifeline. I didn't even unlock it. I dialed the only number that mattered, my mom. Not just any mom, but my mom, the CEO whose influence stretched far beyond boardrooms, into spaces where power whispered rather than shouted. I hit speaker and held the phone casually, as if it were an ordinary call, though every instinct told me it was anything but. The businessman noticed first. His polite smile faltered, a tiny twitch at the corner of his mouth. He straightened slightly, as if sensing that the air around him had subtly shifted. The crew froze, eyes darting between him, me, and the device now amplifying my mom's calm, commanding voice on the other end. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The power was already visible in the slight hesitation of his posture, in the way the cabin seemed to hold its breath. I watched, quietly calculating, as whispers began to thread through the crew, subtle, almost imperceptible. There was a rhythm to their movements now, a nervous uncertainty, like watching water ripple in a pond when you drop a stone. Every glance, every barely perceptible shift in stance told me the dynamics were changing. This wasn't about tickets or first-class seats anymore. This was about discretion, influence, and operational necessity. The room had become a chessboard, and I had just moved the most unexpected piece. The man in the suit leaned back, attempting to regain composure, but it didn't work. His authority, the kind money and status usually afforded him, felt suddenly hollow. I could almost hear the tension crackle across the cabin, a static that spoke of unspoken rules being rewritten in real time. And through it all, I remained seated, earbuds dangling, as if this were all still just a mundane flight. I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corner of my lips. Hidden power is a curious thing. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare, it works quietly, invisibly, until it can't be ignored. And right now, it was impossible to ignore. The whispers among the crew grew louder, subtle patterns of fear, respect, and uncertainty blending into one thick, charged atmosphere. But then, just when it seemed like the balance of power had shifted entirely in my favor, something happened that no one could have anticipated. The cabin, the man, the crew, all waited, tense and silent, for what would come next. The atmosphere shifted in ways you could almost feel through the floor beneath your feet. After the call to my mom, the crew's faces were no longer simply polite. They were taut, their smiles strained like wires about to snap. Every movement they made seemed measured, almost rehearsed, yet clumsy in its hesitance. I watched the subtle tremor in the flight attendant's hand as she adjusted a napkin, the way the purser's eyes flicked repeatedly toward the cockpit, then back at me. Each glance told a story the passengers didn't see. They were out of their element, unsure of which protocol, or whose power, they were meant to follow. I noticed patterns others overlooked. A steward who usually hovered behind passengers froze mid-step, then sidestepped me with exaggerated caution. A whisper exchanged between two attendants carried an edge, almost frantic, and they quickly dissolved into separate paths, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the cabin. It was as if a signal had been sent, one they weren't entirely certain how to interpret. Their operational experience, usually so reliable, faltered under the invisible weight of my mother's authority, projected now through a simple speakerphone. The businessman in the suit shifted uneasily, attempting a polite cough that betrayed nothing but did nothing to hide the tension. His air of confidence, normally sharp and unassailable, wavered in the quiet ripple of uncertainty. He glanced at me once, then down at his papers, his eyes flicking back to the cabin crew, trying to read a story that had just changed without a word being said. And then it happened. The subtle ripple turned into a crackling charge that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Something no one in that cabin had anticipated, not the crew, not the businessman, not even me, was about to unfold, and it was already starting before anyone could react. The cabin fell into a silence so sharp it felt almost solid, as though the hum of the engines had stopped entirely. I had barely put my phone down when the first sign of movement rippled through the VIP staff. One by one, attendants began to gather their composure, but something was different. Something in the air made even the most experienced faces pale. The purser cleared her throat, her usual calm authority replaced with a tight, hesitant stiffness. Then, the announcement came, over the intercom, smooth and professional, but carrying an undertone that made every passenger sit up straighter. Effective immediately, the voice said, the cabin crew assigned to this flight will be relieved of duty. I blinked. The words didn't fully register at first. Relieved of duty? That sounded like a polite way to ask someone to step aside, but the expressions on their faces told a darker story. Eyes widened, murmurs sparked, and a ripple of confusion spread from the front to the back of the cabin. The man in the suit finally looked up, his confident posture cracking into something uncertain, almost vulnerable. Hands clutched at clipboards, napkins, even their own uniforms, as if grasping for explanations that weren't coming. The flight attendants didn't argue, they simply began to gather their belongings, moving with a mix of shock and disbelief. It was swift, clean, and final, as if every ounce of operational experience they had was suddenly null. And yet, no one could explain why. The passengers whispered among themselves, their curiosity blending with a barely suppressed tension. Cameras and phones were hidden quickly, but the eyes, the stares, they couldn't be hidden. I felt something I hadn't expected, yes, but mixed with a palpable fear. This wasn't just about me refusing to give up my seat. Something larger had been triggered, something invisible, almost too precise to see unless you knew where to look. My mom's voice over the phone had shifted the balance of authority instantly. And yet, the mystery gnawed at me. Why this sudden, sweeping dismissal? What had they done wrong, or who had they failed to notice? Passengers leaned forward in their seats, straining to understand, but the answers weren't coming. I felt a shiver of anticipation, a pulse in the air that whispered something darker and more consequential than anyone suspected. And then, right as the last attendant stepped into the aisle, the man in the suit made a small, almost imperceptible movement. A glance, a twitch, that hinted the story wasn't over. Comment justice if you think they deserved it. But ask yourself, what really just happened in that cabin, and why did no one see it coming? Even as the cabin emptied of its VIP staff, my mind was racing faster than the hum of the engines beneath us. I could feel the weight of everyone's gaze, the sudden shift in energy, but somewhere deeper, I was replaying the call with my mom. Her voice, calm, authoritative, just slightly edged with the power only someone who commands thousands of people could wield, had changed the room entirely. It wasn't just that she was my mom. It was that she was a CEO, a mover of industries, a force that operated in a world where decisions were made in whispers and agreements were brokered before anyone else knew what was happening. I remembered the stories she'd told me growing up, the subtle lessons tucked between bedtime tales about meetings in glass towers and conversations that no one outside the boardroom could understand. Power, she once said, is not about being loud. It's about being noticed when it counts, and invisible when it's safer to watch. Those words echoed now as I watched the stunned passengers, trying to process why the crew had vanished. They had no idea that this was more than a simple passenger dispute. It was a glimpse of the hidden networks that quietly shaped business and influence, the invisible threads that tied privilege, access, and operational necessity together. Even the man in the suit, whose confidence had once been unshakable, seemed to sense the invisible weight pressing down on him. I caught a flicker in his eyes, a subtle twitch in his fingers, the kind of detail that only someone used to reading rooms would notice. My hands, still slightly trembling from adrenaline, flexed around my phone as if it were both a lifeline and a shield. Around me, the cabin lights reflected off polished surfaces, the soft murmur of whispers growing, passengers craning their necks to see what had happened, to fill in the blanks. And yet, the bigger picture remained hidden. There were pieces I couldn't see yet, threads of corporate intrigue, quiet maneuvers that might not reveal themselves until we were miles from the ground. But instinct told me something. The man in the suit wasn't what he seemed. Something deeper, more dangerous, was at play. And when that truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't just be shocking. It would rewrite everything that had happened in those tense minutes. What no one realized yet, not even the passengers leaning forward with curiosity, was that the real storm was only just beginning. Even as the hum of the plane settled into its usual rhythm, nothing about the cabin felt normal anymore. The empty rows where the VIP staff had stood were like ghost spaces, leaving a quiet tension hanging heavier than the recycled air. I could feel it pressing in from every corner, the sideways glances of passengers, the faint shuffle of briefcases, the nervous tightening of the man in the crisp suit's jaw. Something in his demeanor had shifted. He was no longer just a frustrated traveler trying to reclaim a first-class seat. He was cautious now, almost calculating, and I realized with a jolt that the stakes were higher than I had imagined. I studied him closely, noting the small tells, how his eyes darted to whispered conversations, the barely perceptible tremor in his hand as he adjusted his tie, the way he lingered too long by the galley, as if listening for instructions he shouldn't be receiving. This wasn't about me moving seats anymore. This was about information, access, and influence. I had seen my mom in similar rooms countless times, where the wrong move could unravel millions of dollars in a deal. And instinctively, I understood that I was standing in the middle of one of those very moments. My pulse was quick, but my mind was calm, sharp, alert, reading the room like an X-ray. I noticed the passengers craning their necks, whispering speculation, unaware that they were witnessing a chess match far above their comprehension. The cabin lights glinted off polished trays and tabletops, revealing the subtle patterns of compliance and hesitation I had seen before, but now each detail felt like a clue in a puzzle I hadn't even begun to solve. The man's polite facade was cracking, a sliver of tension breaking through his carefully constructed mask. I could sense that he was gauging me, trying to measure whether I was just another obstacle or something more dangerous, someone who could see through the pretense and threaten whatever hidden objective he had. And at that moment, the air in the cabin felt electric, charged with the knowledge that the simple act of refusing to move had sparked consequences far beyond a personal slight. Something told me that what I had just interrupted wasn't an isolated incident. The threads of secrecy and deception were tangled, stretching beyond the aisle I occupied, and whatever was about to happen next could shift everything. Then, almost imperceptibly, the man shifted his weight and glanced at something behind me, his expression tightening in a way that made my stomach drop. Something was coming, something no one on this plane yet realized. The cabin felt quieter than it had moments ago, almost as if the sudden emptiness from the fired VIP staff had sucked the air out of the room. I kept my gaze on the man in the suit, but now I wasn't just noticing his anxiety, I was noticing patterns that didn't add up. He didn't check his ticket once, didn't glance at his boarding pass like someone who truly belonged in first class. Instead, he fidgeted, scanning, listening, calculating. And then I caught it, a subtle code in the way he adjusted his cufflinks, a glance at a muted conversation in the corner, a movement so precise it could only be intentional. My heart thumped in rhythm with the plane's engines, but my mind stayed sharp. Something about him wasn't right. The way he observed the cabin, noting every hesitation, every whisper, was too practiced to be a random passenger. I could almost hear the echoes of my mom's boardroom, the way spies and corporate saboteurs operated quietly, invisibly, until it was too late. And suddenly it clicked. This wasn't about first-class privileges. This was about information, access, and secrets. I looked around, catching the subtle discomfort of the passengers, unaware of the invisible game unfolding before them. Every glance, every nervous shift of weight, was a piece of the puzzle. And I realized that if I had given up my seat earlier, if I had backed down, none of this would have come to light. I was standing at the edge of something much bigger than myself, something dangerous. A small piece of paper slid across the aisle, tucked discreetly into a passenger's tray. I didn't move, but my pulse quickened. The pilot handed her a note mid-flight, but what it said would shatter everything. Stay tuned. I could feel it before anyone else did. The shift in energy, The kind of silence that isn't just quiet, but tense, deliberate. The man in the suit, who had seemed polite, confident, and untouchable, now looked cornered. Not visibly angry, but unmasked, exposed. I realized then, in a heartbeat, what I had only sensed moments ago. He wasn't a passenger at all. Every small detail, his unnatural attention to conversations, the way he ignored his boarding pass, the subtle code in his movements, clicked into place. He was a corporate spy, planted to intercept, to manipulate, to sabotage. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, though no one knew why. Whispers stopped midair, eyes darted from him to me, and a strange tension settled over everyone like a weight. My mind raced. If I had moved, if I had given up my seat, the mission would have succeeded. Millions of dollars, countless lives depending on the deal my mom was closing, would have been at risk, all because the assumption was that I didn't belong. I didn't flinch. I didn't apologize. I only held his gaze for a moment, letting the realization sink in. This wasn't just about a seat. This was about power, about the kind of subtle, invisible authority that too often goes unchallenged in elite spaces. By refusing invisibility, by asserting presence, I had altered the course of events in ways no one in this cabin could have imagined. The man's confidence wavered. His carefully constructed composure cracked like thin ice. Crew members avoided his gaze, passengers stared, and the hum of the engine seemed louder somehow, vibrating through the tension in the cabin. I could almost feel the ripple of his plan collapsing silently around him. And then it hit me, this wasn't over. Even exposed, even powerless, he could still try something. The stakes had grown higher, the danger more immediate. What I had thought was just a confrontation over a seat had become a high-stakes battlefield of hidden power, corporate intrigue, and silent defiance. She never saw it coming. Subscribe so you aren't caught off guard. But just as I leaned back, letting the tension settle, I noticed a faint movement in the overhead compartment. Something small, deliberate, a signal that someone else might still be watching, waiting for a chance to act. The cabin stayed quiet, but it wasn't the ordinary hum of an airplane anymore. It was thick with disbelief, like a suspended pause between reality and what had just happened. People shifted in their seats, eyes darting toward me, toward the empty spaces where the crew had once moved with practiced ease. The absence of those faces, people who had always represented authority in first class, felt like a vacuum, and everyone seemed to sense it. Whispers started, low at first, almost secretive, and then slowly gained volume. I could feel the weight of the stares, some curious, some judgmental, others tinged with awe. Passengers I'd never met, from the man hunched over his laptop to the woman nursing a lie, were now witnesses to something bigger than a seat dispute. It wasn't just that the VIP staff had been fired, it was the implications of why. Some leaned in, murmuring, trying to make sense of it. Others looked away, unwilling to confront what had just unfolded in plain sight. Even the air felt different, charged. The hum of the engines, usually a comforting background, now vibrated through the cabin like an echo of tension. I noticed the subtle shifts in body language, a tightening grip on a handbag, a slight step back, a fleeting glance at the overhead bins. The power of visibility, of refusal, was radiating outward, touching everyone silently. And then there was the man in the suit. He sat frozen, his carefully constructed image unraveling. I didn't need to speak, he already knew the damage had been done. I could feel the subtle energy of my own presence, my quiet insistence, resonating in the cabin. It was a strange mixture of triumph and vigilance, knowing the ripple of what had happened would follow us beyond the plane. As the plane began its descent, a new tension took hold. What would happen the moment the cabin doors opened? What murmurs, what judgments, what hidden consequences waited for me in the terminal? The story wasn't over, the air was thick with anticipation, and every eye still carried a question. Who would dare challenge power next? And then, as we touched down and the wheels kissed the tarmac, I noticed a figure in the aisle, not a passenger, not crew, but someone observing, calculating, and moving toward the exit in a way that promised the story wasn't finished yet. Stepping off the plane, the world felt different. The polished floors of the terminal reflected a sea of faces, some curious, some wary, many whispering to each other as if afraid to speak too loudly. Every glance seemed to measure me, weighing my presence against invisible rules I'd never agreed to follow. Even the rolling luggage and the announcements over the PA system felt distant, like background noise to the undercurrent of murmurs swirling around me. I caught fragments of conversations, soft but sharp enough to sting. "Did you see what happened on that flight? She didn't move, the crew was fired. I wonder who she is." That was bold. Some voices carried admiration, others skepticism, a few edged with resentment, like the idea of a young black woman asserting herself in first class was somehow unnatural to their expectations. Walking past gates and kiosks, I felt the weight of judgment pressing in, yet beneath it was an odd kind of recognition. People noticed the way I carried myself, calm and composed, unshaken even as whispers followed. Each step seemed amplified, every subtle gesture, adjusting my bag strap, checking my phone, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, noticed by strangers who had only hours before assumed I didn't belong in spaces like this. The tension was in the air, sticky and potent. Questions unasked hung like fog. Who taught her to stand so firm? What power did she wield to disrupt what seemed routine? Some followed with their eyes, some with their curiosity, and others only with suspicion, as if the terminal itself had been rearranged by a single act of refusal. And as I neared the exit, a figure paused by the security line, half shielded by a column, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. There was something there, something calculated, something waiting. It wasn't just curiosity. It was anticipation. The story was far from over. Walking through the terminal, I felt the echo of the flight lingering in every step. The hum of conversation, the clatter of luggage wheels, even the distant call of boarding announcements, all of it seemed muted compared to the storm inside me. I replayed the moments over and over, the polite demand to give up my seat, the tension in the cabin, the subtle shift in the crew's posture, the quiet authority of that single call to my mom. Every detail felt magnified now, not just a memory, but a lesson carved in the air around me. I realized how often invisibility is assumed in elite spaces. People judge before they see, decide before they listen, and expect compliance without question. Today, I had refused that script, and the consequences rippled further than anyone could have predicted. The power of a single choice, the impact of standing firm, the quiet authority that comes from knowing your worth, it all hit me with the clarity of a sudden spotlight. But reflection wasn't just about me. I thought of the passengers who had stared in disbelief, the crew whose compliance had been assumed, and the businessman whose plan had unraveled. Each of them was caught in a web of expectation and assumption, and my refusal had torn that web just enough to expose the fragile balance of privilege, prejudice, and power. It was a reminder: courage doesn't always roar, and influence isn't always visible. Sometimes, it whispers. Even as I moved toward the exit, a sense of responsibility settled over me. I had witnessed how quickly assumptions can dictate behavior, how easily someone can be deemed unworthy of space or respect. And yet, in that same moment, I had seen how disruption of the expected, quiet, deliberate, and unshakable, can shift the narrative entirely. The lesson was clear, but the weight lingered. In elite spaces, visibility is power, and courage is a currency often underestimated. And just as I turned to navigate the last stretch of the terminal, I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, a figure lingering near the shadows of the lounge, someone who had been watching far more than they let on. Their gaze wasn't casual. It was intentional, measured, like they were calculating the next move, and I knew, in that instant, this story wasn't finished. The moment the plane touched down in New York, a strange silence followed me through the cabin. Every pair of eyes that had once lingered with doubt or quiet judgment now seemed to watch with a mix of awe and unease. I gathered my things slowly, savoring the quiet satisfaction of having held my ground, of refusing to vanish into the background like so many before me. The hum of the jet engines faded behind me, replaced by the low murmur of passengers and rolling suitcases, yet the tension I had felt on that flight still vibrated in my chest. I walked through the terminal with a new awareness. Every glance, every whispered conversation seemed to confirm the invisible lines I had been challenging. For years, people assumed I wouldn't belong in spaces like this. Not because I couldn't, but because they never bothered to ask. Today, I proved that assumption wrong, not with a fight, but with the quiet assertion of my worth, backed by the unexpected leverage of hidden power. Passengers who had initially ignored me now gave subtle nods of acknowledgement, fleeting but unmistakable. Some avoided my eyes entirely, perhaps unsure how to face someone who had quietly exposed their biases. I caught the reflection of my own calm determination in a polished glass panel, and it struck me, courage isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the decision to stay put, to resist being invisible, even when the odds feel stacked against you. And then there was the lingering thought of those who had lost their jobs, the VIP staff who had bowed too easily to a false authority, unaware that their compliance was the real danger. Their absence was a reminder that elite spaces don't just demand manners, they demand integrity, and they reveal the consequences of failing to question what's presented as normal. As I stepped into the arrival hall, a flood of emotions washed over me: relief, empowerment, awe, and the subtle thrill of having disrupted a carefully orchestrated illusion. The lesson was clear: visibility matters. Courage matters. And the power to protect oneself, and others, can manifest in the quietest of acts. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt unseen in a room full of power, I want you to take a moment right now. Subscribe to the channel to stay connected to stories that challenge assumptions. Like this video if it moved you, share it so others can see what courage looks like, comment below about a time you refused invisibility, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that could change the way you see the world. Because what happened on that flight wasn't just about one seat, one girl, or one call. It was about all of us, about recognizing power, holding space for dignity, and refusing to let silence define us. And if you carry this lesson forward, imagine how many invisible battles could suddenly be won.